So now that we have seen how to load a dataset, be it from the Hugging Face hub or from your local disk, and also sort of access the train, test, splits and so on, we can now see how to access specific samples, right? So the train dataset has 20,000 rows. Now you may just want to access a few samples and see what the data looks like, right? So let's see how to do that. Yeah, so let's just do that, right? So we'll first access the train split, right? So we had loaded the IMDb dataset which had the train and test split. Now I want to look at the sample number 1000 in this dataset. So I'm passing it the index 100, right? And this again I think intuitive to understand. You're looking at the IMDb dataset which was a dictionary and hence it contained the train and test split. So now you're looking at the dataset object corresponding to the train key or the train split. Now within that dataset object, you are passing a specific index and saying I want to look at the 1000th sample, right? So now let's run this, and I hope you understand what you expect to be printed here, right? You expect a specific example to be printed, and remember the example had a text and a label. So let's see what gets printed here, right? So as you can see, the label is 0, whatever that means, positive or negative, and the text is whatever it is, right? It's some movie review which was at that index number, right? Okay, so going forward, yeah, it is a dictionary object with the two fields. It's not a dataset itself, right? It's just one element from there, so it's just a dictionary object which has the label and the text fields. Another way of accessing it is to sort of pass a list of IDs. Here of course that list is like a singleton, it just has one element, but you are saying that select all of these IDs from that split, right? That's what is happening here. Now we get a dataset object because now you have said that you are going to select a subset of the original dataset. So it returns a dataset object. In this case, you had passed only one index, so the number of rows here is just 1. But you could have passed a list of indices, and now you would got a subset of the dataset which corresponds to those indices, right? So if you just want the first 100 samples, right? So when you're starting training, you may want to start with like a small dataset just to make sure that the entire code runs well. So you could just create a small subset of your original dataset by saying that I want the subset like 1 to 100 indices, right? So first 100 indices or any random subset of the dataset, so that you don't end up running your code on the entire dataset while you are still testing and debugging the code, right? So you still get the dataset object here, and you can use this small dataset for your experiments. So you can also select a range of samples. So here in this case you're saying the range is 0 to 100, and the 2 indicates that we are going to take every even numbered sample, right? So we are going to take the 50 even numbered samples between 0 to 100, and you are passing that ID. So now again, if I run this cell, I think you understand what would happen. You would get 50 rows, right, and a dataset object because you're taking a subset of the original data. When you say use the select method, you're getting a subset as opposed to directly passing the index as a object, right, in which case you can only pass a single index. So now you have got the 50 rows from your original dataset, and you can use this small dataset for test toy experimentation till you're satisfied with the code that now you can use it on the larger dataset. Okay, now let's look at one more dataset. We looked at the movie review dataset from the hub. Now let's look at the translation dataset. And we're looking at the WMT14 translation dataset, right? So this is WMT is a workshop on machine translation. So it runs several shared tasks where they release training datasets, test datasets for different language pairs, right? So the WMT14 dataset may have many languages. I've listed a few here. So it would have datasets for the pair Russian English, I don't know what CS stands for, French English, Hindi English, and German English, right? So it might have all of these datasets, right? So we may want to access some of these. So let's see how to do, because in this case we'll not just the dataset name itself may not suffice. As you can see, the unique identifier for the dataset is WMT/WMT14, but within that there are many sub datasets, right? For each language pair you have a specific dataset. So let's see what we can do with the load dataset function in this case. Okay. So I'm going to get dataset config names, get dataset split names, and I'm going to print out all the datasets which are there, right? So let's see what I mean by that. So the first line here prints that what are the different configs within the WMT4 dataset. So there are 5 configs here which correspond to 5 language pairs, and now I'm looking at one of those configs, which is the Hindi English part of the dataset, and that config has 3 splits: train, validation and test, right? Again, I feel it's fairly intuitive what is happening here. So now let me just take a step back and sort of try to say what is happening here a bit more in a bit more detail. So there are sometimes there are datasets which are collections of datasets, right? So WMT14 is one such example, which is a collection of many datasets, right? In this case 5, each of which is corresponding to a specific language. Now similarly, there is something known as the glue dataset, which in turn is a collection of several datasets. It has a sentiment analysis dataset, it has a paraphrasing dataset, it has a question answering dataset, and so on, right? So now you may look at the higher level dataset or the collection, which is WMT14 in this case, or it may be glue in the other example that I'm talking about. And within that, you might want to look at all the config names, all the different other subset datasets that it has, and then access that specific subset. Right? So it's just a hierarchical organization. WMT14 and then the 5 datasets. Then within those 5 datasets, each dataset may have a train, valid, test split, right? Okay, so let's go ahead. Now I want to just load the Hindi English dataset. So I'm going to load that, and I hope you understand that at this point, when I print the dataset, I expect it to print a dataset dict object, which has the 3 keys: train, validation and test. So let's see if that happens. Yeah, thankfully yes. Yeah. So it has the dataset dict object, train, validation and test, and it has certain number of examples in each of these splits, right? And now the features, it says translation. Earlier we were seeing the features as text comma label. Now the features is translation. So we'll talk a bit more about what this features means, but as you can imagine, it just refers to the content of the fields, right? So we'll just talk a bit more about it. If you want all the datasets as a single split, then we can do that. Suppose we want to load everything together. It's typically not done, but yeah, sometimes you just combine the train and validation set, right? Because validation is something that is seen to you. I mean, you're allowed to sort of peep into it. I'm not sure if it's any more standard practice, but in earlier days, you would use the train and validation set for all your hyperparameter tuning. And then once you have arrived at the right configuration, you will mix the train and validation data and create like a bigger training set and then train the model again, right? I'm not sure if anyone really does that anymore, but that's one reason why you may want to merge the splits. So that's why you're saying that I want to create a larger data set here, which has all the splits in it, right? Another reason to do this may be that you're not happy with the original splits that the dataset has, and you may want to create your own splits again, right? So we saw that in this case, the test and validation splits were very small. So you might have an opinion that no, I want to merge everything together and then create a larger test and validation split. So that's another reason why you may want to merge the entire dataset and then sort of use it afterwards. So let's see what happens if I execute this. So now you have everything as one single dataset object, and the number of rows is of course the sum of all the rows that were there in the train, test and validation split, right? So nothing sort of out of the ordinary here. So again, very straightforward to understand what's happening here. Yeah, there are no splits obviously. Okay, now let's talk about the features, right? So I said that in this dataset, if you go back again, the features is translation. In the earlier dataset, we had seen that the features was text comma label, right? Yeah, so it defines the internal structure of a dataset and what is the underlying serialization format. And there are certain features which are already defined, right, for different datasets that are used. And this depends on the type of dataset, which is the task that the dataset is for. The first dataset was for sentiment analysis, so it made sense that it had the features text and label. The second was for translation, so it had the feature translation, and for other datasets there might be other features, right? So let's see what are the features for the translation once again. Yeah, so it is this feature, and now if I print it, it says that it's like a translation class with languages equal to Hindi, English, right? So what that means is that it will have sort of, you could think of it that it might have internally two columns, one for Hindi, one for English, right? That's what, but it just sort of all of this is encapsulated into a class so that it's standardized and serialized accordingly. Yeah, yeah. The feature is translation, and there are various other feature classes, right? These are value, class label, image, audio, and you can look at the entire list. Let me just see. Yeah. Yeah, you can look at the entire list by clicking here, and some of these of course make sense, right? You might have a feature which is just image, you might have a feature which is audio. These are all standard things that you might come across, right, when dealing with the different data sets related to deep learning, machine learning and so on, right? So you can learn more about them here. And when you're doing a specific task, the feature would intuitively make sense to you, right? Because in this case, of course, the feature should be translation and it should contain Hindi data and the English data, right? And internally, as I said, you could think of it as it has two columns, one for Hindi and one for English. Okay, so let's go ahead. Yeah, let's look at one more corpus now. As I had said, this is a part of glue, and the configuration inside it, or the sub dataset inside it, is MRPC. And glue has many such datasets, sub datasets. We are looking at one of those. So the same thing, you load dataset glue, that's the unique identifier. Then within that, you're looking at the configuration MRPC, and then maybe within that, you just want the train split. So if I execute this, oops, what happened? Yeah, it's not executed, I think. Okay, for some reason it's not executed. Let me see if I execute this. Ah, it is. Yeah. So yeah, we are now printing the features. Sorry, I missed that. So printing the features. So first is the index. The second is the label, which is the class label, which has equivalent, not equivalent. So this is a paraphrasing data set. So you can imagine that there are two sentences here, and the label indicates whether these two sentences are paraphrases. That means they are equivalent to each other or not equivalent to each other, right? So that's how this data set is structured, and the features now of course make sense given what the data set is about, right? It's about taking a pair of sentences, hence sentence 1, sentence 2, and then deciding and then specifying whether these sentences are equivalent or not equivalent, right? So hence the set of features that you see here.